it's read, it means you can talk. So you want
I'm fixing to call this to order.
to, you think so?
All right, it's 7 o'clock. We'll call our August meeting of the Tri-State County Planning Commission to order. First thing, we'll have our roll call. Go ahead.
Marion Baker's here. Sarah Murray. Here. John Kerr.
Here.
Rhonda Kiesling. Here. David Nallner.
Here.
David Thomas. David Thomas is absent. Carol Pruitt. Mark Swaffer.
Here.
Thomas Harper.
Here.
Sam Edwards.
Okay. We do have a quorum this evening. Next on our agenda is approval of the July 12th minutes. Everyone's had a copy of these for some time and have had the opportunity to go over them, look for any additions, corrections, or anything that might need to be made. Does anybody have anything that needs to be changed or added to the agenda? I mean, to the minutes? All right, hearing none, I need a motion to approve the July 12th minutes. Moved by Mr. Harper. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Nallner. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please say no. Minutes are approved. On our agenda tonight, there are nothing on the agenda other than under discussion topics, which is our GNRC training. We're going to see a video or okay, Mary's going to give us a presentation entitled An Overview of the Long Range Planning Process. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Mary.
Hello, everybody. So last week, Sam said there was no agenda items for the meeting this evening and thought it would be a good training opportunity. And he reached out and asked if I could give an overview of the long range planning process to you all. So that's what we're going to be doing training on this evening. This training is adapted from another training that my colleagues have done and a few other trainings that I've seen. And it's generally going to be set up a little bit less formally. If we want to talk through anything or have any questions, let me know at any point. So generally we're going to go over the comprehensive planning process, and I apologize if you can't see anything that's on the slide, let me know. I'll change my view, but I don't know how to set this up with one monitor and still be able to see my notes. And I want to make sure that I don't miss anything that we're going to talk about. So this is the list of topics we're going to run through. Yeah, you really can't see that very well, can you? Okay. All right, we'll go. Go. Is that any better? Okay. If I escape for a second, that's just because I'm checking my notes to make sure I didn't miss any good information. So we're going to cover kind of an overview of what planning is, why we plan, the enabling legislation, what comprehensive planning is, the elements of a comprehensive plan, the land use and transportation planning element, the process to do comprehensive planning, some factors that you look at in creating a comprehensive plan, and we're going to walk through an example that I've recently gone through, what the adoption and amendment process is, and what kind of implementation tools are available to help carry out a comprehensive plan. So the first bit here is what is planning, and as planning commissioners, I'm sure you're all very familiar, but planning consists of generally finding out where you are, where you want to go, and then how we're going to get there. Decisions will be made whether there's a community planning program or not. And the difference is that with a good community planning program, there's a greater likelihood that diverse decisions would be made in a more sensible relationship to one another. So generally, progress is going to keep happening. You're going to keep getting development requests. You're going to keep reviewing rezonings, site plans, whether you have a plan in place to review them against or not, you're going to keep getting them in order to make sure we're all making consistent decisions and so just decisions that contribute to what we want for the county in the future. It's best to have a good plan in place. So why plan? I just went over it a bit, but planning accomplishes a coordinated, adjusted, and harmonious development for the community. Land use controls that we have in place, so those would be the zoning resolution, the zoning code, and the subdivision regulations, are inspired by the comprehensive plan and are actually tools to implement that, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so having a comprehensive plan in place gives you an opportunity to zone, essentially, to create those implementation tools, and avoids any kind of arbitrary, unreasonable, or capricious exercise of power in those land use controls. In 1928, the Standard City Planning Enabling Act, SCPA, was put into place. And this act enables the community to produce a long-range plan for development that describes how, when, where, why to build, rebuild, or preserve areas within a community. After the adoption of that, Tennessee and many other states passed their own enabling acts that were based on that SCPA model. The General Assembly enacted Tennessee's planning legislation in 1935. I had a note in here that I thought was fun, and I'm going to go through and make sure I don't miss it. Alfred Bateman, the planner and city attorney from Cincinnati, who was a consultant with the TBA, was the one that drafted the original act that was put into place in Tennessee. So Title 13 of the Tennessee Code is the title that grants the powers to local governments and their planning commissions to do long-range planning. So the powers are granted in TCA 13-3-301 and 13-4-201, and those authorize the powers to plan. 13-3 is regional planning commissions and 13-4 is municipal planning commissions. Title 6, Chapter 58, also known as Public Chapter 1101 of the Tennessee Code, outlines a process for defining 3 basic districts or areas in each county. So under Public Chapter 1101, cities propose urban growth boundaries, while counties propose planned growth areas and rural growth areas. This intent is to, as it says in Public Chapter 1101, eliminates annexation or incorporation out of fear, establishes incentives to annex or incorporate if it's appropriate, more closely matches the timing of development and the provision of public services, stabilizes each county's education funding base, and establishes an incentive for each county's legislative body to be more interested in educating matters, and minimizes urban sprawl. So essentially this intent is to make sure we're matching, one of the big points here is matching the service of public infrastructure with growth areas. That's the more closely matches the timing of development and the provision of public services. So to look at your all's current growth plan as an example, and this was adopted by the legislative body in 2000. This is the urban growth boundary. So with it being a metro, you have both an urban growth boundary and a layout of planned growth areas and rural growth areas, theoretically. And I put this on a bigger slide so we can see it a little bit better. But essentially you can see that the city of Hartsville is outlined in the middle, and there's a slightly larger boundary. So that was the area that was identified as the area that your urban services district could expand to. That's the limit based on the urban growth boundary. So the second part of that is the planned growth areas and rural areas. And this is supposed to be identifying additional areas for growth or that need to be kept rural outside of the urban services district in the plan. Then in the language in the 2000 growth plan, and I'm going to exit this so I can read right from the plan, states that the Planning Commission at the time believed that the term planned growth areas were intended to encompass a broad range of land use and activities at a high or moderate density, including agricultural activities, residential, commercial, and industrial uses. Population growth plans done during that planning process in 2000, actually I think it was around 1998 when they started the process, did not indicate a need for extensive expansions into undeveloped raw land areas to accommodate growth. So it was determined that there would be no designations of planned growth areas. The plan adopted in 2000 notes that the county recognizes under Public Chapter 1101, it's responsible to provide urban level infrastructure within any proposed planned growth areas. The rural area designation represents a holding pattern where densities are lower and the levels of service are acceptable for the more rural lifestyle and that many people seek by choosing to live there. So at the time that this growth plan was adopted, it was the opinion of the Planning and Zoning Commission that the definition of rural areas did not prevent lands from being used for any commercial, residential, or industrial development, but that any such use should be less dense and retain the character of that area. The Planning Commission decided in the plan that except for the territory included in the urban growth boundary, the rest of the county's landmass would be designated rural area. The plan also notes that rural areas are additionally intended to encompass areas that are specifically intended to be preserved, including public land protected from development, such as government lands, nature preserves, or major wetland areas. So in looking at this here, you can see that the urban growth boundary for the Hartsville Urban Services District is identified by that thicker blue line. And then there's actually no area outside of that that's identified as a planned growth area, because based on the population projections at the time, the Planning Commission felt there was no need to develop any of the land outside of the Urban Services District at a higher level that would require extending infrastructure to serve beyond there to whatever extent that would be. So one of the powers of a regional and municipal planning commission, respectively, is the preparation and adoption of a general plan. And this is in section 13-3-301 and 13-4-201 of the Tennessee Code. Like I said, 13-3 applies to regional and 13-4 to municipal. A general plan, also known as a comprehensive plan, is defined as a plan for development of an area which recognizes the physical, economic, cultural, political, aesthetic, and related factors of the community involved. It consists of policy statements, goals and objectives, standards, maps, and statistical data for the physical, cultural, and economic development of the community. The term comprehensive is really interchangeable with both general and long-range planning. We often use the term comprehensive in order to describe the well-rounded plan for the future of an area. So general might typically apply as a term in order to summarize that policies and proposals don't necessarily indicate specific location or detailed regulations. Sometimes we use the term comprehensive because a lot of times in these growth plans or general plans, you're not just looking at land use and transportation, but you also might look at economic development, housing, infrastructure needs, community facility needs. So it's that term that describes the well-rounded and holistic future of an area and the vision for the community. So a comprehensive plan is adopted as a policy guide to guide decisions about the physical development of the community. And there's really 4 essential purposes to the comprehensive plan. It represents the community's vision for the future. It fulfills a legal obligation. It's a guide for decision-making, especially for you all and elected officials. And it provides a single comprehensive document that we can put in all of those holistic elements that contribute to the vision for the community. Land use, recreation, utilities, transportation, all of that can be in one holistic vision. It's important to note, like I said, general plan, comprehensive plan, and long range plan all get used interchangeably a lot. But the important piece to communicate with the word long range is that a comprehensive plan is looking beyond current issues that are in the community. Those might be touched on a little bit, but the horizon for the plan is really going to be 10, 20, 30 years. 20 is the typical planning horizon. So you're thinking about what growth and development is going to happen further out and less focused on, what the current controversial rezoning is down the road. And like I said, it'll provide the plan for those local land use controls to implement further down the line. So there's a number of elements that go into a comprehensive plan, and I've kind of listed a couple of them. And I've seen this listed in different ways in different places, but these are some important elements that are often included. Usually have your introduction where you look at existing conditions, and there's some kind of statement of the vision and goals and objectives for a community. There's often a chapter looking at economy and economic development and discussing any strategy for that in the community. Housing is usually an important element. A lot of plans will take stock of what existing housing they have, what needs they might have projected based on how many more people are coming into the community, what kind of housing is desirable, because you might have, a lot of single family, and that in the future you need to focus on a mix of housing. So that might be talked about in a housing element of a plan. Land use and transportation, often regarded as kind of the most critical and most crucial point. and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Community facilities and infrastructure is often a very important part as well. And then you have your implementation piece where you look at what you need to put the vision from the plan in place. So that could be capital improvement programs, your land use regulations, so your zoning code, your subdivision regulations. And then also it's often important to identify different funding sources that the county might want to go after to help put some of this in place. So why do we emphasize the LUTP, or the land use and transportation planning element? Why did I say this is the most important? Land use and long range planning is often regarded as the most crucial element of the comprehensive plan because land use is interconnected with all other elements, including community facilities, infrastructure, and transportation. So what land uses are being designated to different places or existing in another place is going to have influence on how much traffic you generate, how much infrastructure is needed to serve it, what housing is going to be in that area. So it's influential to all other pieces in the plan. So it's often looked at as one of the most important. So what goes into a land use and transportation plan? It often identifies the existing uses of land. And if you look on the right side of the screen, that is actually the existing land use map that was in the 2000 growth plan that was adopted. So that was the existing land use at the time. You can see it was hand drawn in there. This land use and transportation plan designates future use or character of land. I have it stated here as future use or character of land because in the past in planning, the thought was often when you're creating a future land use plan for how you want land use to work in the future of your community, you might have looked at it specifically use-based. You might say, okay, this is going to be the place for commercial, this is going to be the place for residential, this is agricultural, this is industrial. And that is still an opportunity, a way that a lot of communities plan for future land use. However, there is a lot of movement towards, instead of identifying uses, identifying what you want the character of an area to be, and leaving the uses to then be determined by what's in the zoning code. So for example, we're doing a comprehensive planning process in Gallatin, and we've created a community character manual that shows, for example, their general urban area is an area where we've identified that they want to create an environment that's walkable and pedestrian friendly and has mixed use. So instead of saying, these are the uses allowed there, their comprehensive plan instead says, this area should strive to have small setbacks, put parking behind buildings, have sidewalks associated with development. And then those will be tools that they'll later take. And when they rewrite their zoning code, they'll use those to create the regulations that will go in place in that area. So that's pretty common, instead of just doing it based on, we want this area commercial, we want this area residential in modern planning. It's always important to describe any reasoning you have for decisions made in the plan for why a certain land use or why a certain character is desired in a certain area. This land use plan becomes a guide to official decisions regarding the distribution intensity of development. So this is how you decide what areas are going to be the most dense in your community, and what might be the least dense. And again, that all plays into how you have to serve it with infrastructure and utilities, what community facilities you might need to add nearby. That all plays into what density you're deciding in this land use plan. It becomes a guide for public decisions on the location of future, the second bullet is just what I touched on. And again, this can cover a period of 10 to 20 years. 20 years is a pretty typical horizon for a comprehensive plan. Any questions or thoughts or comments before we continue? Okay. So in the comprehensive planning process, I've seen this outlined in a couple of other presentations as 6 steps, but I went ahead and turned it into 5 steps, with the 6 being something that I think should happen throughout and doesn't necessarily fit in a spot in the steps. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So the first step is defining the question and identifying the issues. The second step is review of existing conditions. The third is formulating goals and objectives. The fourth is adoption and implementation. And the fifth would be evaluation. And the typical 6th that I've pulled out as should happen throughout this is asking for community input. On the right side of the screen, there's the quote, "Make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood and probably will themselves not be realized." This is a Daniel Burnham quote. Daniel Burnham was a architect and planner. He is famous for having played a large role in the creation of the master plan for Chicago. And also Washington, DC. So these were the first 3 steps that I had up on the screen a moment ago. And I'm gonna pull this down just so I make sure I don't miss any of my notes. The first step is defining the question, identifying issues. So when first undertaking a comprehensive plan, the first thing that we hear from a lot of people when we start this process, when you go out into the community and ask them what they want, it's often that you'll hear them say, "I like it the way it is. I don't want any change." And despite the fact that many residents might value that status quo, communities are not static environments, but they're constantly subjected to change. Whether we like it or not, we're moving forward. New things are going to come in, something's going to change. And because change is always occurring, planning for the future is always needed. A common misconception is that the only purpose of planning is to address problems in a community, but plans can provide solutions to existing issues. They can also provide guidance on how to affect what is wanted and avoid what is not. So for example, in creating the Gallatin Comprehensive Plan, we heard a lot that the character of the area and how they felt in the community and their whole small town feel was very important to them. So a lot of what we looked at in the plan was, okay, what elements of that are important? How do we preserve those? How do we make sure that this character, this feeling continues forward, even though there's going to be change coming to the community? To do this, the first step in the planning process is to identify what issues are to address in the plan or what needs to be maintained. And municipal planning commissioners, that's you all, play a natural role in advising the governing body on which issues they feel should be addressed in a comprehensive plan. So if you were kicking off a process, we might have you all in a steering committee, or you might appoint a steering committee, and that steering committee might say, okay, here's priorities for what we think most need to be looked at in a plan. And that would kind of lay the groundwork that we would build off. So you might say, you know, our biggest issue is we want to make sure we have better walkability. And that's like top of the priority list to address. Or we, you know, are really concerned about what housing we have available. Are we going to need more housing moving forward? So you might say bike and pedestrian connections and housing are like the big crucial elements. And then obviously, like I said, everything affects everything. So we'll probably look at it all, but that's the guide to start those addressing issues. The types of issues that are addressed in a comprehensive plan are community specific. So communities with declining populations, for example, face different issues than communities that have stagnant or growing populations. So defining these issues, whether they're problems to overcome or traits or characteristics to maintain, is the key and important first step. The second step is review of existing conditions. And reviewing existing conditions can include reviewing housing, demographic, and socioeconomic characteristics and trends, what existing land uses there are, the extent of the transportation system, utility and community facilities, natural features affecting development, and natural, historic, and cultural resources, and also looking at population projections and what we think the future growth potential in a municipality is. So by looking at all these elements, and maybe a few more, it allows for further refinement of the issues that will be addressed in the comprehensive plan and might give indicators on policies that will be effective in addressing them. So once we've identified those issues and done a lot of background research and completed that, community development goals and objectives should be identified. And this is often something that requires a lot of community input, which is why I pulled it from 6 into the whole process, because this is the point where you're usually talking to the public and saying, okay, we have all this background information and studies. What do you all want the community to be? Because they're an essential piece that's going to help you understand what the vision is and then be able to make goals and objectives from there. These goals and objectives that you're going to create should seek to address the issues that were previously identified and studied. The goals and objectives are usually stated abstractly and may be considered by some to be too idealistic. But the statements of these goals and objectives, however difficult they might be to achieve, is an important step in defining and identifying the environment that you're going to be working toward. They should be organized into plan components or chapters that organize similar goals and objectives together under larger subjects such as land use, housing, and open space. I'm going to talk through a little example later, and you can see how the organization of the draft plan we're doing right now is done based on different goals that the community has. This portion of the comprehensive planning process is usually the most time consuming and requires adequate study and emphasis. Determining the best course of action to address issues requires support from appointed, you all, and elected officials, as well as from the community at large. Like I said, this is where public input is super important. While a solution might address the problem, proposing solutions for which little political support or little community support actually exists would often result in a plan that never gets implemented. We do it, we put it on the shelf, and we forget about it. And like I said, most planning commissions can be super important in providing guidance on what issues the plan should address. So the next 3 steps that were in there, step 4 was adoption and implementation. Through the adoption process, we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, the formal adoption process for a comprehensive plan. And after adoption is when implementation begins. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, and we'll talk a little bit more in a bit, but the implementation tools that are going to put your plan in place can include a number of things: capital improvement plans and budgets, identification of funding sources, and your land use regulations. Your zoning code and your subdivision regulations are going to be some of your most important tools to put that plan in action. It's often common for a community and advised for a community to create an annual work plan for implementation. Sometimes this isn't done on an annual basis. Sometimes it's done as here's our short-term goals, our medium-term goals, and our long-term goals. And your short might be stuff that you think you can get done quickest in 3 to 5 years, and then it might be 5 to 7. And then the further down the line is the bigger items that might take a longer time to put into place. The 5th step is evaluation. And this step is really important because this comprehensive plan is always going to be a living document and needs to be revisited for the changing community. We spend this time creating population projections and asking the community what they want, but none of us can really see into the future. So there's always going to be some things that are going to change. For example, COVID-19 pandemic, happened in the middle of the planning process in Gallatin, and that really changes kind of what the community is thinking about and some issues that come to the front of mind. So there's always opportunity to revisit and keep the plan up to date through scheduled review and revision. And again, there's an amendment process for a plan, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. And lastly, there's community input, which I said is going to happen throughout the planning process, because through all of this, it's important to build and trust and create a plan that's going to be adoptable and implementable. So the range of community input that you're asking for might change with every step of this plan. For example, we might start really high level and say, okay, what do you want the community to look like? What's your vision? You get people's knee-jerk reactions like, I'd like a water park. Just kind of that initial really high level thought where no one's getting any information and you're just asking them what they want. After you do that, you might finish all your studies and background information and start to identify goals and objectives. And then the next session, you might be asking the community to react to those. Do you agree with these? Do you disagree with these? What do we need to change as we go forward? And then during the adoption and implementation phase, that's where we're going to be asking the community to dig into the meat of the plan, actually give you review and changes and thoughts before you go ahead and adopt it. So in creating the land use and transportation plan, and really in all of the plan, you start with that review of existing conditions. And there's a lot of factors that go into consideration for that. I listed a bunch of those before, demographics, socioeconomics, all of that background information, but another bunch of factors to consider, especially in looking at the land use and transportation portion, is going to be the regional context, natural environment, as I mentioned, demographic and socioeconomic factors, existing land use, existing transportation network, and what infrastructure and facilities you have existing. I think the next few slides, okay. So the next few slides are going to go through what's all in the growth plan that you all have in place, and just kind of show you the maps that were taken into consideration in creating your growth plan. So this is the table of contents from the growth plan. And whoops, I just kicked the cord and moved the screen. 2000. Correct, 21 years old. So when this plan was created, the analysis of land use was done an analysis of public services. You can see it on there if you can't see this, and then went into the designation of the rural and planned growth areas and what future public services and infrastructure needs there would be. This is a map that I found in our GNRC file. So this is what you might look at considering regional context. This is just a generic map to pull it up. But for example, we might look at Hartsville and Trousdale County as a whole and be thinking about slightly, what pressures might be coming from Sumner County, what's going on there. Also looking to the south and Wilson County and understanding what's happening to communities, Lebanon, Mount Juliet, how those are growing and changing. And then looking over to the east to Macon and Smith counties, it's important to understand what regional players, what other pressures nearby communities are experiencing as kind of one of your first steps in the process. This was the existing land use map, and you saw half of it before on the side of the screen that was done for the 2000 plan. Like I said, this was hand drawn, just kind of cool to look at. This was a existing land use study that we did in 2011. This was the illustration of natural constraints and factors affecting development. So this was where the growth plan at the time identified areas that are restricted by floodplain and steep slopes. You can see that this is mostly restricted just to the Hartsville area, and the floodplain is along the river, and there's just a couple steep slopes. They're hard to see on the map very well. This is another remake of that map that we did. All the gray are areas with slopes over 15%, and then the floodplain is shown by that blue. So natural factors are something that's going to affect where your community actually has room to grow, right? Because development's less desirable and more at risk in a floodplain, and is damaging to the environment and creates potential for erosion on steep slopes too. This was the illustration of the existing water lines done in Hartsville at the time. So this was understanding where we run water right now, what capacity there might be to serve additional development on those water lines, and if extension were to be needed, had they designated additional planned growth areas outside of where their current water service was. This is the major thoroughfare plan that's in place, and identifies all the streets as arterial and collector. And I'm going to switch the screen up. This is more just fun to see. Make sure I can get logged into it. So this is not publicly out there yet, but hopefully it will be soon. We've created a mapping application that you can go to online that shows some of these different factors. That will be, if you were to go through a process to update your comprehensive plan, this would be probably a way that we might look at and process some of this information as opposed to just on paper maps. Now we use a lot of mapping applications. So this is the existing zoning. You can see some of these other factors we've talked about. Like this is the inventory of wetlands that exist in the city. I'm not sharing the screen right now. Am I? I'm like, why does everyone look at me a little lost? I have to switch which screen I'm sharing. Right. Okay, so this is the inventory of wetlands. So this is an environmental factor that would restrict development. The red up here, that's steep slopes. I can turn on a layer to look at all the flood hazard areas in the community, protected lands. We have fire stations on there, because again, you want to look at what community facilities you would need to extend or service any additional growth. So just kind of fun to look at what we've moved to from paper maps and modern planning. Stop share. So as I mentioned, GNRC has been working with the city of Gallatin to update their comprehensive plan. The first draft of the plan right now is currently available online for public review and comment to their citizens and their elected and appointed officials.
Hey, what's their process? I mean, they did the same thing, they drafted one 20 years ago, come back 20 years later and said.
So their most recent that they actually did, they did a plan in 2010. And now 10 years out, wanted to not scrap all of it, but start with that as a base and update, because where they thought they would be 10 years ago is very different than where they are now. So that was it's more of an update, but it really does end up being essentially the same process, because we're going to go through all the steps that you would to kind of start from scratch. So if you all wanted to go through that process, it'd be the same kind of thing. We'd be really updating what you have in place, but there's a lot of updates that would need to happen, and a lot more information that's available to us now. And I'm gonna stop share. So there's just a couple of things that I want to show you all, since this is fresh and on my mind to look at. So like I said, in looking at the existing conditions, that second step in the process, there's a lot of items that you look at, such as what the population projections are, what your socio and demographic information is. And why did my computer just, oh man. My laptop's on its last leg. I'm supposed to be getting a new one this month, so bear with me. I'm gonna restart, sorry. What's that? So the page I was going to show you on the City of Gallatin, we made a website for their comprehensive plan and put a lot of information about the demographics. Oh, we're back here. Okay. Demographics of the community, so that the community members could see that online too and understand what our basis was that we were working from to start the process. Okay, now I need to log back into the Zoom. Mm-hmm. I hope. Here, okay. Switch the screen. Okay, so this, like I said, was the website that we had created for the plan, and put a lot of this data that we were looking at in the existing conditions online for the public to see. So, for example, we looked at, put together a population snapshot that looked at demographics in the community, the current population, and the rate of increase in the population. We can make, yeah, it's a jump. This map shows projected growth in different areas, the guess at it. Some of the housing information, we looked at the median list price and shared that, so everyone kind of knew what housing was costing in their community. Owner versus renter occupied, the average household size, employment, ECD, economic development was a really important element of the plan for them. So looking at what of the largest employers exist, current number of jobs. Another important piece was understanding where the Gallatin residents work, what commuting habits people have into and out of the community. That obviously really affects transportation patterns, and it's going to change, you know, what capacity you need in roads or what transit you might need, a lot of different factors. This is the growth snapshot. So the projections at the time showed that 270 people or so were being added each month to the county. They were paving 9 football fields of pervious surface a year. how much tree canopy and agricultural land might be lost to development in the future if their policies stayed the same. So basically this was just a way for everyone to get an initial look at what factors were going to be affecting their community in the future, starting off. So the process actually started before I was at JNRC, but we started this plan around the start of 2019. A comprehensive planning process altogether, it's usually 12 to 18 months, can be closer to the 18th month side. With this process, we were held up a little bit in the middle during 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic and had to shift a lot of things to virtual. So usually 18 months is about the timeline. And then I wanted to share just the working draft so you can all see. And again, this is a draft that is not adopted, but it's nice to be able to talk through some of the elements I mentioned. Try to get this full screen. Okay. Can you see that okay? Doesn't want to be full screen. Okay, so it's not full screen, but you can kind of see the headings, and that's really what I'm just gonna be walking through anyway, to talk about the elements that we talked about. So this first portion, the first few chapters are the introduction and existing conditions and establishing kind of the goals and the vision for the community. So this first chapter goes over what the process is, frequently asked questions, and then dives into the history of the community as a basis to start. Snapshot of what looked like 70 years ago, 40 years ago, 5, and then today. This is a community snapshot. So this is basically what I just showed you all that was on the issues and trends page. So this is where we're diving into all the background studies. This is element number 2, that help further refine issues to be addressed in the plan. What's that? Yes, this is current to Gallatin. Oh, yeah, we could have. We didn't do that. I mean, we did like look at changes as part of, that's just didn't make it into the document, but yeah, that's definitely something that we looked at. I could pull up the appendix and show you all the charts of information, but that's, you know, a little bit more nitty gritty to look at. I don't remember what the figure was, and I wouldn't know off the top of my head, but this is less focused on the numbers because, again, this is a different community. Just want to walk through kind of the elements in the process. So this chapter 3 is where we started to establish what growth was forecasted in the community, what trends there were for population and employment to be expected. And in creating the plan for Gallatin, we went through a scenario planning process with the community where we looked at, this is the current pattern of development that you have, this, and then we created 2 scenarios for how they could move forward to 2045 if they adopted a set of land use regulations and policies that allowed for primarily development of single family residential out into the undeveloped areas, what the impact of that would be. And then if they went with a scenario that put more compact development, focused it in their city limits and closer into town, what the impact of that would be. And took that to the community, did a whole process, and got feedback that they desired the more compact growth opportunity because of the scenario we created in a program that helped to see how many acres of agricultural land would be maintained, how much more open space might be availability, what bonuses for walkability and traffic congestion might be offered based on one or the other. And this is again where we captured some more of the community feedback that was received during the planning process. And then this is where we get into the guiding vision and goals. So this is the portion that might take the longest usually during a plan, where you come up with what your vision statement is, what you're striving towards, what goals are going to help implement that, and then kind of the objectives, the smaller pieces that you need to get done to achieve those goals. So you can see listed at the bottom of the screen, those were kind of the overarching themes or goals for the policy framework in this document. And again, they're listed out here. And I touched on a little bit, sometimes the elements that are in a plan end up being organized under one chapter. So you're kind of taking what your goal is and turning it into a chapter based on things that will contribute to that goal. So there was a goal related to the economy. So there's a chapter that was designated in the plan to how Gallatin could grow their economy. And objectives and actions that contributed specifically to that portion of the goal. And I touched on a little bit earlier, preserving character was something that was really important in the Plan Gallatin process. They want to make sure they retained their small town feel and those really special areas that meant a lot to them as a community. So that became a chapter in the plan, and we looked at specific characteristics that were worth preserving, and then had actions to contribute to that. Maintaining livability was the portion of the plan where we talked a lot about housing and how to house all the people that were going to be coming to the community, and what levels of different housing needs that they might have, as well as community facilities, I think was also captured in this portion. Improving infrastructure has a dedicated chapter. And actions. And then this portion here was where we got into what became their, well, what will become once they adopt this and then go into the process of updating their zoning code. This is what's going to be guiding that. This is the land use policy that was created. So as I mentioned, this was more focused on the character of the area as opposed to specific uses. So we created these spreads that kind of show what they were striving towards for each of their areas to look at. And their areas went on a spectrum of what we call transects essentially. So they started with their general urban or their downtown core, moved out to general urban, suburban, and rural, and each of those areas in their community had a different field that they're aiming for. So the policies were going to vary based on those community character areas. We looked at some sub areas in this plan. And then these are the chapters on implementation, which I'm going to jump out of here and go back into the slideshow now to talk a little bit more about implementation and adoption. If I can figure out. Okay, so public chapter 1150 was adopted June 13th, 2008, and amended the plan authority and process for comprehensive planning. The Planning Commission already had the authority to adopt the plan. However, TCA 13-3-302 and 13-4-202 give the local legislative body the prerogative to adopt the plan by ordinance or resolution following the Planning Commission's adoption. So and this is something that Gallatin's going to do, their plan after they're done reviewing it. We've got the draft where it wants to be. Their Planning Commission will review it and take action and adopt it, and then it'll go through their council for 2 readings. So what's the drawback to this? Why wasn't it done before? The drawback to this would be that all amendments to that plan must then follow the same adoptive procedure as any legislative actions. So if an amendment was to be made to the plan, it would go through the Planning Commission and then 2 readings at the County Commission before it would be formalized. And that can be a pretty extensive process. However, adoption by a legislative body is important because it brings both that legislative body and you all as the planning commissioners to the same page with that vision for the community, right? Provides an opportunity that gives more teeth to the plan to make the change happen and keeps all that community leadership in. So both the county commissioners and you working towards the same goals and understanding the same vision for the community. It used to be that the PC simply adopted the plan. And I'm realizing now that you're all seeing my notes and not what's on the slide. Used to be that the planning commission simply was the one that adopted the plan. And then as of 2008, the regional or municipal planning commission holds a public hearing, published in the newspaper 30 days in advance. And once the planning commission has adopted and certified the plan, they then transmit their action to the county or the municipal legislative body who may adopt the plan by resolution or ordinance, whatever the process is. So with both bodies adopting the plan can be amended on the initiative of the legislative body. Such initiative would be transmitted in writing to the planning commission for review, consideration, and vote. The planning commission would act on that amendment within 61 days. And other than in some exceptions that vary based on population, if the planning commission votes to not approve an amendment or transmits the amendment back to the legislative body with no recommendation, the legislative body would be able to then approve that amendment by a majority vote. So how does the growth plan and general plan relate? The general plan can be adopted as an element of the jurisdiction's growth plan through the process that was established in Title 6, Chapter 58, Public Chapter 1101, we talked about a little bit earlier. But if the general plan is not adopted as part of the growth plan, so if you separately create a growth plan and a general plan and they're not together, it's still required to be consistent with the plan for growth. So how you're planning for anything else in addition to growth needs to be consistent with your general plan for the community. Pretty good logic, I'd say. So after, and I'm going to pause here before I go into implementation. Any comments, or should I just keep pushing forward, or questions? Okay. Specifically in Gallatin, and we're just starting this, we're going to do a comprehensive plan for Rutherford and Sumner County coming up. So we started with doing a plan for how community engagement would work for the planning process, a plan for a plan. In Gallatin, we started with doing a kind of kickoff party on their courthouse lawn where everyone from the community came out, and then redid that same activity in every one of the districts. They have 5 or 6 counselors in districts. And so we wanted to make sure we were getting into every community. And that first round, it was, like I said, just kind of the visioning phase. So we were just asking for people's knee-jerk reactions. So there was a lot of, show us issues you have in your neighborhood on this map. Tell us what your vision is by just writing it on this board. Just that initial, we didn't give you any information, give us your thoughts. What's that? It was in person. And then we came back with that and said, this is what we heard, and asked the community if they agreed or not. And that was also in person. We had a big public town hall in one of the colleges in Gallatin, and had a lot of people come out and gave a presentation on what we'd heard and asked them if they agreed or not. From there, we did that scenario planning piece that I talked about a little bit, where we presented to the community 2 options for how they could grow into the future. And that was about when we had to shift to virtual engagement. So that was actually a presentation we did online. It was Facebook live streamed, and then it was on Microsoft Teams for people to join. And we presented a bunch of information about, this is what might happen if you grow with this pattern, this is what might happen if you grow with that pattern. And then received a lot of feedback in comments, both at that meeting, and then following that meeting, there was a survey out for people to comment. And then we actually had a number of different focus groups from people who listened to that and then wanted to talk more about what they'd heard in the presentation. We did virtually some focus groups where we had 6 or 5 people from the community having conversation with each other to process that information. After that, we are now well into the drafting phase and now moving to the adoption phase. We did a presentation, initially a kickoff for the public comment to the city council during their work session last week. And now the draft document is online because of the need to still probably collect feedback mostly virtually. People can email their comments in, or there's a link to a survey where they can give us feedback on the draft document. And then that will follow the adoption process. Like I said, once the Planning Commission and City Council decide it's at a point where they want to move it forward, they'll advertise that public hearing 30 days in advance, and then it'll go through to the Planning Commission and then have 2 more readings by their City Council before it's officially adopted. So there'll be multiple opportunities for people to still come to those public hearings and give that feedback. So after the plan is done and adopted, there are a number of different tools that are important for implementation that make sure the plan is carried out. Sorry, I was just checking how I'm doing on timing and where I'm at in the slide. So tracking progress and maintaining the plan is important. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. A lot of communities will create either an annual work plan or keep timeframes, short, medium, long, to all the goals in the plan and identify what they want to accomplish in 3 to 5 years, 5 to 7, and further down the line, and then check back in to see how you're doing with getting those short-term and long-term and medium-term goals accomplished. And like I said, a lot of times there could be unexpected or unforeseen change or something new that might bring a whole new element that you didn't consider, and you might need an amendment to the plan, and that's when you go back through that amendment process. So that's part of tracking and maintaining as well. Identification of funding sources. This is usually the portion of a plan where you say, okay, here is a listing of basically all grant opportunities that might be out there. Here's where to find the cycles for when those are available, and here's what community goals or objectives you can accomplish by going after some of those funding sources. A lot of times after you complete a comprehensive plan, you might do follow-up plans. So these would be sub-area plans, bike and pedestrian plans, et cetera. So maybe when you were looking at the community as a whole, for example, in Gallatin, we had pretty general character areas, but there were a few focus points where they want further guidance or do a deeper dive with the community that lives there to understand what the specific vision is needed for that community. So you might go back and do a sub-area plan where you add to what you did in the comprehensive plan for the city as a whole and create specific policy for that area. Or I have bike and pedestrian plans listed in here. You know, walkability might have been a goal, but you don't know where to start. When you're doing the comprehensive plan, you might say, we need sidewalks everywhere. So that might be a deeper dive that you do after you adopt the comprehensive plan and specifically go through a process for that. Citizen feedback and community engagement, I've got it up here again because I can't iterate enough that it's going to be important throughout. You're always going to keep getting information from citizens, and you need to adjust and, you know, find out if you need to amend a plan or change how you're implementing part of it based on the feedback that you're getting. Capital improvement plans are often a follow-up piece because now that you've looked at the growth of your community, the areas you want to grow or the areas you want to maintain, or maybe the areas that you need to revisit or revitalize, you have an idea of what areas you might need to prioritize to improve or build out infrastructure. So this is the portion where you come back and you say, okay, here's improvements we're going to make and how you budget for them and prioritize those moving forward. And then the piece that's most important to you all in the implementation tools would be your subdivision regulations and then your zoning code and zoning resolution. So oftentimes after a community completes a planning process, they'll revisit what they have in their subdivision regulations and their zoning code, and oftentimes do kind of a complete overhaul to make sure everything that you are using as your tools for land uses, subdivision, align with what you did in your plan as a whole. And that is all that I have. So if we want to dive in and do any discussion or have any more questions or thoughts, I enjoyed giving this presentation to you all. This is the first time I've done a training.
I would ask, if you're going to ask a question, if you could get to a microphone, because the people watching online can't hear you and it won't be recorded.
Mary, you did say all our maps are online. You can provide the link for them.
I don't know that that link is live and available, but I can share a link again. And I think you all have a copy in the binders that you have of the previous growth plan with those maps in them. If not, I can send those out.
Yeah, like the flood map and the growth plan that you're talking about. So yeah.
Yeah, I can make sure that you all have a copy and send that out again via email. I think you should have a printed copy, but I don't know how well the maps worked out in those. So I'll send it digitally as well.
Mary, just a quick question. Was cost ever part of the planning process? It's easy to say, I want sidewalks county line to county line. Is that part of the planning as well? Because obviously the county's got to endure those costs.
I mean, like I said, that might be a goal that you put in. It might be prioritize walkability, and your objective might be to add sidewalk in all these places. And then you come back with your implementation tools, your capital improvement plan, and say, okay, here's what we can actually afford. If we want to prioritize walkability as our #1 goal, that's going to determine how much you put in the budget for redoing and adding sidewalks, for example. So,
I will follow up. I'm sorry, I will follow up a little bit on that. When they did the downtown transportation study that led to the streetscape down here, they did do some of that. Probably not to the extent Mary's talking about, because it was just sidewalks. It wasn't water. It wasn't everything else. It was just the sidewalks. And we have put it in our budget this year, $40,000 to do sidewalk rehabilitation plan. And we've also got an engineering firm. We're going to put together a 5-year plan of how to rehabilitate the existing sidewalks. And then we were planning to update it every year to maybe expand it out going further, but that'll be part of this process. I mean, you can talk about, we think this area needs it. And also the Industrial Development Board, where they retained retail strategies to do the first year they look at downtown retail development, and the first thing that they score you on is your walkability for your community. And out of 100, we scored like 42. So they really said, they look at, especially in this downtown area, what's the walkability to downtown if you want to develop your retail here. So that was something that, in conjunction with their plan, the 2016 transportation study, and going ahead and redoing some of these sidewalks because they're not ADA compliant. They don't meet other requirements. And as you've seen, some of them are not crumbling, they've crumbled. So we put that in the plan this year, and we hope to go ahead by spring and go ahead and replace some of the sidewalks, especially around Total Image in that area that are the worst.
And another piece that we mentioned briefly in the implementation tools is funding sources. So again, besides putting it in a capital improvement plan and figuring out what budget you have to build sidewalks, that might be an element that you say, okay, there's these 5 grant opportunities that come up on cycles for us to be able to apply and either, get matching funds to build or just funding to build sidewalks. And we're going to make sure that we don't miss an opportunity to apply for this funding. So.
And that falls in line with I guess a couple of months ago, I came and asked you if you'd support us filing a letter of intent to apply for the 2021 multimodal access grant through TDOT. And we did submit that letter of intent, and they invited us to apply. So we're putting that together right now. And that's something I was going to ask a little bit later on as far as some of the planning, if we could use maybe next month's planning commission meeting to invite some members of the public, specifically those that are in the project area, but the public as a whole, to come and give their feedback and see what they feel about that going forward.
So our plan for growth is 20 years old plus. And part of what I heard in your presentation is that how Gallatin came together on this. They appointed a steering committee to help draft original kind of rough bones of a plan. Is that correct?
So I wasn't actually at GNRC for the start of that process, so I don't know, but I will say in Lebanon, when we kicked off and wanted to do an update to our comprehensive plan, the first thing that we did was, yes, a steering committee was appointed by the mayor, and they reviewed what was in place in the previous plan and selected kind of those elements that we wanted to focus on. And that's when we went ahead with the direction of that steering committee and put out a request for proposals to ask for consultants to go through the process for creating that new plan.
Do you plan your infrastructure before or after?
Pardon?
Your infrastructure, how do you, what does that come into play at?
Throughout, when you're creating, I guess, when you, this is how I said land use kind of plays into everything. Is important in everything. If you're going to designate that a certain area of your community, you know, needs to be prioritized for revitalization or might be where you expect the most growth to come, the things that come with that are going to be needing to look at what community facilities and infrastructure exist there, and then what more you need to service that area or what improvements you might need to make to service that area down the line. So you mean you can't prioritize an area for, it's like chicken and egg, right? We can't say we're going to grow a whole bunch over here and then catch up later with the infrastructure. You have to understand that you're going to need it in place for that growth to occur and happen. Because, you know, sewer, water, fire, I think that's a big one I've been hearing from the county commissioners lately, fire service, that's all going to be needed to adequately provide the level of service that you need for people and businesses in an area. But yeah, your initial look and your initial start of the plan, it's definitely super important to get an understanding of all the infrastructure that exists, and start from there to figure out how to align your land use plan with infrastructure availability.
Mary, just curious, did they assess how well the 10-year plan worked? I mean, did anybody really look at, were we close? Were we not close? I would suspect that's an extremely long time. Right? Especially the way we're changing these days, even in our little community.
Yeah,
I'd be shocked if Lebanon and Gallatin, if they're even, 20
Yeah.
years would be not even the option, I wouldn't think, for those guys. Just curious.
yeah. It's pretty common to, when you're kicking off a process, to either update or start a new plan, to go through and look at all of the policy that was in your previous plan and identify which objectives, you know, might not even be applicable anymore. And then also understand which ones you measured up to, which ones you're still working on that you need to carry forward, and what might need to be tweaked based on, you know, it's still relevant, but we actually want to change it to this based on the feedback that we heard from the community. So that's definitely part of that first background step, is understanding what you had in place before that needs to be updated, or it doesn't. Some of it just carries over. It's still relevant if you never accomplished it. Awesome. All right, if we don't have anything else, it's an hour of our time. I don't know, Sam, if you want me to touch on anything else or.
Well, let's, does anybody have any other questions for Mary? She's presented a good presentation tonight. As one of the few that was around 20 years ago when we did that. It is a long process, and it's takes a lot of work, but the thing that I heard her say, and the thing we didn't have a lot of 20 years ago, for us to develop a plan going forward, we're going to have a lot of input. It can't just be this committee. We're going to have a lot of input from county commissioners, the mayor, and then, like Thomas was talking about, you know, infrastructure, things like that, you know, because we don't control all our own infrastructure. You have, you know, Bethpage and Cascadian Springs Water District actually is serving the fastest growing area of the county. And, you know, and that's on them. You know, we would have to find out what are their plans and that type of thing. So that, you know, it is a very entailed process. Not, again, it would, you know, it'd be wise, but we're gonna have to get buy-in from a whole lot of other groups and things like that to begin this process.
Yeah, and I didn't really touch on that, but in addition to community input, you know, those are your department directors, your utilities, those are all people that you bring in, and you need to ask them their needs and what issues they see as well. And that all becomes part of the comprehensive element of the plan. But yeah, they are absolutely some of the most important people to bring to the table and get information from, especially when you're kicking off the process.
Right.
Well, the other key thing I kind of picked up on too is that you want this to be a living document, to be adjusted as you go along. So that would be, to me, you'd want to set something at least no longer than every 2 years to review. Where are you at to that? Are we meeting it with what we have come in as far as growth or not? That sort of thing. Not necessarily that you change anything, but just to review it and make sure you have an active review of it. And I don't know how much has been done because I wasn't part of this committee before, but to me, I would definitely think you would need to review it more often. So it's not a 20-year look back and you probably have. I'm not saying that you haven't. I'm just saying that I know in my end of the county, there is explosive growth. And I've seen that happen in Gallatin, Lebanon, and Mount Juliet as well. And I'm not sure how they're getting ahead of it, but I feel like we've got more coming. That's going to be like a tidal wave if we don't get a review.
I agree with you. I think we do have more coming. I think that's a given. You asked how it was assessed over the years. It actually depended upon who was mayor and what their priorities were, as most things happen in a small county. And this is the only one I'm aware of. So I know, you know, and to be honest with you, going forward, it depends upon the priorities of the elected officials at that time and the emphasis and things that they want to put on things, and which should be driven by their constituents who elect them, you know, and that type of thing. So it should be, it should just roll over all into one, and let's hope that happens.
Well, I think you could also introduce a resolution for the review process to happen actively so that the constituents know where we are to the plan. That was my only point.
Okay. Other questions, comments?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. As I took office and started looking back what we had in place, we didn't have a lot of plans in place at the time. That's something I've tried to get work on. You know, we did a master plan improvement for the parks. We had that transportation study. We're trying to implement that. We had that downtown revitalization effort we're going through, working with the state of Tennessee and that retail strategies. I had contacted GNRC to help us put together a strategic plan going forward. And they also asked about the comprehensive plan. That's what I'd like to do that as well. So kind of the first step was the strategic plan and then transition into the comprehensive plan. I think we sorely need that. Ours is very much out of date, given the growth we're experiencing and all the numbers that are changing. And as I agree with you, the tidal wave we're looking at, the amount of people that are moving here from other states or moving from selling in Davidson County or Wilson County or Sumner County and moving here. I think we need to go through that planning and try to get ahead of it, specific on all that infrastructure. I'm very concerned about, you know, the capacity of the roads, water, sewer, broadband. I know we've done a lot of work on broadband, but I'll make sure we get ahead of that to try to compensate for what I think is coming. And I also do want to look at the different funding sources. That's where I mentioned the multimodal grant. There's other grants out there to help you with that as well. But the first thing you need to have is a plan in place to submit to do that. That's where the transportation plan is coming very handy. But I think if we had this plan in place to specifically show us where we're lacking in our infrastructure and that kind of thing, I think it would help us much going forward for other grant applications and maybe some loan forgiveness or something like that programs going forward. So this is something I'm very interested in. I hope we get it in place, and as long as I'm here, we're going to try to stick to it and carry it forward as we go.
I think the mayor's exactly right. That's what we need to do. And with his leadership, hopefully we can continue on this path and develop a new plan. All the things that he hit on are extremely important. We were very fortunate that Tri-County Electric that the state government changed the broadband laws to where electric cooperatives could get in and run those lines. And we've been very fortunate that Trousdale County has, within the last few years, relatively a big majority of our citizens can now access, if they want to, the internet through Tri-County Electric. We wouldn't have had that opportunity before without the state government changing those laws, actually, and Tri-County being able to do that and being willing to do that. Hopefully, I understand in this new federal government plan, there's a lot of money in there for broadband and stuff, and maybe we can finish up. Tri-County can get some grants, or how the federal government's going to do that, and finish all of Trousdale County to where all of Trousdale County has that opportunity. Because not only is that important just from a work standpoint, but schools and everything else that broadband affects everything now. Questions, comments? Sam, do you have any report from your office on how's building permits going, anything like that?
So we still have active construction. A lot of our projects are somewhat stalled at the moment, with some materials being hard to get. You'll notice if you drive down like 231 and various locations that you'll see where they've half bricked homes, or they'll break around the windows, because windows are apparently a commodity at the moment. And it's taken 3 months to get a window. So most of the time they'll order those before they even dug their footers. But you'll start noticing that around there. Hopefully that's going to start petering out, and they'll be able to get more windows quicker. For my understanding and for what I saw last week, the lumber prices and material prices are dropping. So they're going back to a closer to a previous level. I don't think they'll ever go back all the way down, but construction is still going forward. I believe the subdivision behind the administration building should be starting site prep soon. I believe they're waiting on the materials to go back to the normal cost. And complaints are persistent every day, so we're working those as we get them. So if anybody's got any questions for me, you can ask me now or call me at the office.
Anybody have any questions for Sam? I'd like to say we welcome our members of the board of the BZA tonight for this training. I'm glad y'all are here. Training is very important, and that's how you learn about things. I think we were all interested in the way Gallatin's doing things, and that kind of gives you a good example of what's going on and those type things. Any other questions, comments? If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion by Mr. Swaffer, second by Mr. Noller. We are adjourned.